Hello, welcome back. My name is Ari, and in today's video I am going to be talking about the Forgotten Realms novels. Now, I started a project earlier this year where I was reading the Drit series, which kind of died off, but I will eventually re-pick that up. And I was getting questions about the Forgotten Realms books, like in whole. There are currently 293 books in the Forgotten Realms universe, and although publication has slowed down a lot from the 90s, there are still books coming out based in Forgotten Realms universe. I get questions like, where do I start? What should I read? Do I have to understand Dungeons and Dragons to read in this universe? Which books can I skip? Things like that. So in this video today, I am going to talk about those questions, mainly like where to start. And unfortunately, that answer is not just super straightforward. There are a lot of places you could start in Forgotten Realms. So I'm going to kind of go over a couple of more important aspects of the universe, and then you can decide where you want to start. Now, Forgotten Realms originally was a campaign setting in Dungeons and Dragons created by Ed Greenwood, and it evolved into this book series, which Ed Greenwood is one of the contributing authors to. In the Forgotten Realms universe, a bunch of different people are writing about different settings and different characters that all exist within the Forgotten Realms Dungeons and Dragons campaign. But you don't have to play or even be familiar with Dungeons and Dragons to read or enjoy Forgotten Realms. I have literally never played Dungeons and Dragons in my entire life, even though I have a basic understanding of it. And I love Forgotten Realms novels, so not necessary at all. Also, there's a lot of Forgotten Realms novels that you could really easily skip over. Once we get the basic outline of a skeleton, you can pick and choose what in the universe sounds interesting to you and read that. And you can expand that however you want. This video is not going to be all-inclusive. If you want like a list that's just like every Forgotten Realms novel in publication order, go to the internet for that. I'm not going to take the time to list out almost 300 books in different ways you can read them. Please keep in mind that this is just starting points and notes of interest and not an exhaustive list of all the different ways you could read these books. Interestingly enough, there are not really that many starting points to Forgotten Realms. It started out pretty simple and then bloomed into this like huge thing and then kind of came back together at the end. So I'm going to start out talking about the two ways that I don't necessarily recommend you start, but if you want to, you can. If you want to start chronologically, which that's the time that the books happen, not necessarily when they're published, but the time that the events of the books happened, you're going to start with a book called Evermeet. So Evermeet happens at 30,000 DR, which is it's a date, and it's about the elves. And this is long before the events of most of what you see in Forgotten Realms happens. Most of what happens in Forgotten Realms happens between 1,000 and 1,500 DR. So that is 29,000 years before the main bulk of Forgotten Realms is when Evermeet takes place. And it's really just the origin of the elves. Do I think you need to start there? No. I don't necessarily think you should read the books in chronological order. The stories jump around so much that reading it chronologically is not going to do anything for you. If you want to read like a specific series, like maybe Drit's series chronologically, that might be something that you could do. That's what I am doing right now. Instead of reading them in publication order, I'm reading them in chronological order. But the overall Forgotten Realms universe, chronological, probably not. Publication order. Now, this is kind of like the completionist thing to do, is to read the books in publication order. And even this you can do in two ways. You can do publication order of like literally the order that every single book was published in, or you could group the publication order into like trilogies. Because there's authors writing right around the same time. So at the peak of Forgotten Realms, you're gonna be in the middle of 5 or 6 series at a time, because all of these different authors are writing the books and all publishing right around the same time. So if you're going to read in publication order, unless you're really good at keeping track of things, I would say do it publication order by the start date of the series and not necessarily by like actual publication order. But you could do that too. You could do however you want. If you're going to start with publication order, you're going to start with a book called Dark Walker on Moonshae. And this is a trilogy about druids. So if you like druids, it's a good place to start. The Moonshae series, I think it's got 2 parts, so 2 trilogies, is interesting, but it's not one of like the really, really popular books in the series, which is the next step that I'm bringing to you. Is there are 2 really, really popular Forgotten Realms characters who have a lot of novels based off of them. And this is where I would really suggest starting, is with either Drizzt or Elminster. Drizzt is written by R.A. Salvatore. He is a drow, and drow as a race in the Dungeons and Dragons universe are an evil people who live underground. Drizzt is a good guy, and through the through R.A. Salvatore's many, many books following Drizzt, you will learn like why Drizzt is good when his entire race of people is evil. So everybody loves Drizzt. R.A. Salvatore is a fantastic writer. I'm reading the Drizzt books right now. Well, I kind of stopped, as I said, but I'm going to get back to them anyway. Not important, but Drizzt is really what people get into Forgotten Realms for most of the time, and Drizzt books are still being written. There was a Drizzt book that came out in like July of this year. So his story is not done. If you are going to read Drizzt, there are 2 ways to start with that. I do recommend reading it in publication order, and that is going to be The Crystal Shard is the first book. But you can read it in chronological order, which I believe Homeland, is the first book in chronological order. I do think you should start in publication order, because the first 3 books in the Drizzt universe, starting with The Crystal Shard, are written much differently than the rest of the novels. And it's very jarring to go from the Dark Elf trilogy, or to go from Drizzt's origin story and have that very, very well written series, to go back to the original trilogy and then get back into R.A. Salvatore's great writing. The problem is with the original trilogy is the editors for Forgotten Realms were very, very strict with what R.A. Salvatore could and could not do with his characters, and they didn't give him a lot of control. It reads very, very much as a straightforward D&D campaign and not necessarily a novelization. But after the popularity of that original series, he gained a lot more freedom to write as he will, and the rest of the books in the series are fantastic. So If you are determined to read Dritz and you're not really feeling that first trilogy, it's important to read. You need to know what happens in that because that sets up the whole, like his whole story. But just note that the writing in the Icewind Dale trilogy is not as good as the rest of the Dritz books, and it just gets better and better as time goes on. There you go. If you want to start with Dritz, start with the Crystal Shard in the Icewind Dale trilogy. You can buy it as a compendium. The other way to go, other main character is Elminster. Now, Elminster is a human mage who is kind of the narrator of the realms, because Elminster is the character of Ed Greenwood, who created the Forgotten Realms universe. Like, he created the D&D campaign Forgotten Realms universe. And he created this universe is just a way to tell himself stories when he was 8 years old, and then it ended up in Dungeons and Dragons. So, Elminster is, like I said, the narrator of the Forgotten Realms universe, and his books read that way. A lot of people really love Elminster, but some people don't like him at all. I haven't read any Elminster books since I was in high school, so I remember liking Elminster at the time, though I was more a fan of the Chosen of Mystra, which are a bunch of women, like priestesses of the goddess of magic. And Elminster is the only male chosen, but I was always more interested in the women's stories for hopefully obvious reasons, but there was a lot of overlap with Elminster in those series, or in the stories about the women. So I have fond memories of Elminster. I just know that Dritz is more popular than Elminster. But if you're really into Dungeons and Dragons and want to know more of the mind of the creator of Dungeons and Dragons, then starting with Elminster is definitely the way to go. For that one, you're going to start with a book called Spellfire. And I can't really tell you as much about this as I can about Dritz because, like I said, it's been 20 years since I've read any of these books. And you can read these side by side. You could read the Icewind Dale trilogy and then switch over to Elminster books and then kind of go back and forth. And you can also like supplement other Dungeons and Dragons books as the series sounds interesting to you as you want. But that is really my recommendation, is start with Dritz and or Elminster, and then look at the other books and see if anything interests you. Like if the synopsis of the book sounds interesting, read that trilogy or series. And if it doesn't sound interesting, then don't read it and you're probably not going to miss out on anything. There are two very important things that I need to note that while you're reading Forgotten Realms, that if you miss the events that these books take place in, you're going to be very confused because they are frequently mentioned, and I'm going to explain why here in a second. The first is the Avatar series. I don't think it's a trilogy, but it might be a trilogy. But the Avatar series was written in 1989, and it happens fairly early in the series. You've got like Moonshae, you've got the Icewind Dale trilogy, and you've got like the first 3 Elminster books, and then the Avatar series comes out. Now, this is important to read because this is the Time of Troubles, is what this covers. And the Time of Troubles is a really, really big event in the Forgotten Realms universe because it rearranges the pantheon of gods. So either you need to read the Avatar series and understand what went on, or just look it up on like a wiki online if you have no interest in reading the Avatar series, because for many, many books in the Forgotten Realms universe, they're going to mention the Time of Troubles. And if you don't know what events taking place from the Avatar series, you're not going to really understand what they're talking about when they mention the Time of Troubles. What is the Time of Troubles, you ask? Without spoiling it, and on a meta level, when the Forgotten Realms books began writing, it was second edition of Dungeons and Dragons was what the actual D&D game was. The Time of Troubles is going from second edition to third edition, and all of the changes they made going into 3E, it like changed gods and goddesses and all sorts of stuff like that. And so the Time of Troubles is the book version of explaining away why your gods and goddesses are now different in the books than they were when the book started. So that's all it is changing editions, and they needed a way to explain the edition change in the novels. And so they novelized the changes. Excuse me, I need to interrupt myself here. I just said that the changes from the Time of Troubles was the change into third edition. It is not. It's the change from first edition to second edition. So anytime I say third edition or 3E, I really mean 2, not 3. Apologies for the confusion. Like I said, I've never played D&D before. I don't know the differences between the editions. Eventually it changes to the 5th edition. And for that move, there is another huge event, which that one is called the Sundering. And the series, and this one is at least a 5, maybe 6 book series called the Sundering. And this one is really cool. This one's way cooler than the third edition changeover of the Avatar series. But for this one, it's all the major writers in the Dungeons and Dragons universe have their main character going through the Sundering. And again, this is a big event, and there's a couple ways that you can approach this. First, if you were reading like a specific series, let's say Dritz, you can just read Dritz's book in the Sundering series and then continue on with R.A. Salvatore's writing. You don't necessarily have to read the other characters. If you're reading Elminster, you can just read Elminster's book in the Sundering series and then continue on. But if you're looking at the overall universe and you want to see all of these different really important characters in the universe experiencing the Sundering, you can read all of the novelizations. Once I get to that point, I'm going to read all of them, even though I'm only reading Dritz right now, just because it's interesting, right? The Sundering doesn't happen until 2013, so there's not a whole lot happening after the Sundering books, because the peak of Forgotten Realms was like the 90s and early 2000s. So really, those events of the Time of Troubles and the Sundering bookend the popularity of Forgotten Realms, and the mass of the books are right in the middle of that. There's a handful of books that you want to read before it, and there's a handful of books that happen after it. And then you can really just read. If you're only interested in what's happening at the changeover of editions, you can really read just the Avatar series and the Sundering series. You can pick up anywhere that you want. But keep in mind, if you're just going to jump around and read whatever you want, you may want to go to the wiki and see supplemental information. That is where to start with Forgotten Realms, and unfortunately it's not a simple, quick answer. To recap very quickly, and to condense this whole video into a very, very little bit, start in one of these 3 places. The Moonshade trilogy if you're going for a completionist, the Icewind Dale trilogy if you're interested in Dritz, and Chandrill's Saga if you're interested in Elminster. I think that's everything. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you have any questions that I might be able to help answer that I didn't cover in this video, please leave them in the comments below. I will answer you in the comments, and if super necessary, I can always make another video. But thank you for joining me, and I'll catch you in the next one. Bye!